As we continue through Matthew, today I'm gonna preach on Matthew 26, 30, all the way through 75. And that's a really long text, so I'm not gonna read it here. I encourage you to read Matthew chapter 26, verses 30 through 75. And the title of my message is Jesus Alone Was Faithful. I have 5 points in this sermon, and I'll go through them rather quickly. 1, the disciples failed him. 2, Judas failed him. 3, the Sanhedrin failed him. 4, Peter failed him. And 5, Jesus alone was faithful. And so first, the disciples failed him. Do you remember when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane? He asked Peter, James, and John to stay awake with him, watch, and pray. But each time he went back to check on them, they were sleeping. They couldn't even stay awake a little bit and pray with Jesus in his most trying time. And so it wasn't only Peter and James and John who failed Jesus, but really all the disciples failed Jesus. Look at verse 31 of chapter 26. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away. You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." So there Jesus quotes a prophecy from Zechariah 13, verse 7. It's a prophecy about the Messiah being struck. And when that happens, the sheep will scatter. The sheep will run away from their shepherd once he's been struck. And this applies to Jesus' disciples. But the disciples, after they heard Jesus say that, they said, no, that's not going to happen. We will never abandon you. Peter was their spokesman in verse 35. He said, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same. Now, were the disciples lying? Well, I think they were sincere in what they promised, but they couldn't possibly prepare themselves for the amount of fear that they would soon experience when Jesus got arrested. And I wonder what that would feel like to really think that the authorities were coming to get not only your teacher and master, but also you, either to put you in prison or to kill you, right? It's one thing to say or to make the promise to Jesus, I will never leave you. It's quite another thing to keep that promise when the mob is coming with swords and with clubs. Zechariah's prophecy about the disciples came true in verse 56. When the guard came with swords and clubs to arrest Jesus, verse 56 says, then all the disciples left him and fled. They chose to save their own lives instead of risk losing their lives for the sake of Christ. So when trial and persecution came, all the disciples fell away. When Jesus could have used their support more than ever, his disciples failed him. Let's zero in on one of those disciples now, Judas. That's my second point. Judas failed him. Matthew's gospel has prepared us for Judas's betrayal. When Matthew lists the names of the 12 disciples back in chapter 10, listen to how he lists the last two. Matthew finishes the list with Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Right? So Matthew, he doesn't keep us in suspense. He lets us know right away. Judas Iscariot betrayed him, and he put him last in the list for a reason. Jesus knew this was going to happen. During the Passover meal with his disciples, he told them, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. In chapter 26, verses 14 and 15, we read how this took place. Judas went to the chief priests and he told them, what will you give to me if I hand Jesus over to you? And they agreed to give him 30 pieces of silver. Part of the reason for Judas's fall from grace was his love of money. I can't say that's the whole thing, but the Gospels definitely show that that's part of it. One of the Gospels mentions that Judas was the treasurer, and he kept the money, and he used to steal money from the common purse of the disciples. Just maybe a warning there for us that our love for money, our greed, our covetousness can lead us to spiritual disaster, to falling away from Christ. Well, Judas gave the chief priests exactly what they wanted, an opportunity to arrest Jesus in the absence of a crowd. He took them to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus spent the night with his disciples. He led them to Jesus, this mob with swords and clubs who came from the Sanhedrin. He let them know which specific man to arrest. It was dark. Maybe they couldn't tell which one was Jesus. Well, he gave them a sign. He told them, "The one that I kiss is the man. Seize him." And so he betrayed his master with the sign of friendship and affection. And when he kissed him, Jesus said, "Friend, do what you came to do." So far, we've looked at how the disciples failed him. We've looked at how Judas failed him. My third point is that the Sanhedrin failed him. Sanhedrin is another name for a council, right? Our church has a church council. Our city has a city council. Lots of places and organizations have councils. Well, the Jews of Jerusalem had a council, and they called it the Sanhedrin. This council consisted of the priests and other religious leaders who were called elders. And they met to decide on legal matters with religious, political, and social ramifications. I get that from the Lexham Bible Dictionary. Julius Scott writes that the roots of the Sanhedrin can be traced all the way back to Numbers chapter 11. That's the earliest days of when Israel was a nation, when they were in the wilderness. During the Exodus, 70 or 72 elders were appointed to assist Moses. It wasn't called the Sanhedrin then, but it was essentially the same body of Jewish leaders. And back in Numbers 11, it was a really good thing because before those elders were appointed, Moses had the burden of leadership all on his own shoulders, and he would listen to people's problems, whether civil or religious, whatever kind of disputes, and he'd do that from sun up to sundown. He was burned out. He needed help. And so there was appointed this group of elders, and they helped Moses carry the burden of leadership. And this was good. This was essential. But like any good institution in a fallen world, it can become corrupt. This one really became corrupt. Part of their responsibility was to make decisions on legal matters. They were to act as a court insofar as the Romans allowed them. And look at how the Sanhedrin approached the trial of Jesus in verse 59 of Matthew 26. It says, "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death." Now, is that the right way to find the truth? Right? They began with the verdict they wanted. Now they just needed to find the evidence. And so they looked for false witnesses to support their verdict so that they could put Jesus to death. And it actually gives the impression that they had trouble finding even two witnesses to agree with each other to support their verdict so that they could put him to death. But finally, they found two witnesses who said the same thing. But even then, it wasn't enough. What they said wasn't really enough, perhaps, to warrant putting him to death. And so finally, the high priest asked Jesus straight up if he claimed to be the Christ, the Son of God. I'll read that for you in verse 63. The high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so." And by the way, that's Jesus's kind of indirect way of affirming something. He does it several times in this story. "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, that is the Sanhedrin, they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Did Jesus speak blasphemy? No, he was telling the truth. If anyone committed blasphemy, it was those who mocked, spit on and hit the Son of God. And it was the high priest who hated him without cause. The Sanhedrin failed Jesus. And they failed the Jewish people as a whole, as a nation, because the Jewish people entrusted the Sanhedrin with great responsibility to make these important decisions regarding religion and other matters. And they should have recognized that Jesus was the Christ. They should have seen his miraculous signs and listened to the words that he was saying and believed in him. They should have rejoiced at his coming, that God was visiting his people to redeem them through this man. But they rejected him. These words from the Gospel of John apply to the Sanhedrin. John 3:19, this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people loved darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. My fourth point focuses on how Peter failed Christ. Which one do you think hurt Jesus more? Judas's betrayal or Peter's denial? Peter was certainly a closer friend to Jesus than Judas, as Peter was part of the inner three, along with James and John. Peter was often the leader and the spokesman for the other disciples. Remember when Jesus predicted that all the disciples would fall away and be scattered, Peter was the one who stood up and said, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. But he did, 3 times, just as Jesus predicted. While standing trial before the high priest and before the Sanhedrin, Jesus was brave. Jesus was speaking the truth about who he was, knowing that it would cost him his life. But contrast that with Peter. At the very same time, Peter was outside the court of the Sanhedrin in the courtyard, and before a servant girl in front of a fire, Peter denied that he even knew Jesus because he was afraid for his life. What a contrast. If we read Matthew closely, we see that Peter's denials escalate, or they get further in intensity as he goes from the first to the third denial. The first denial is in verse 70. It says, but he denied it. Second denial is in verse 72. And again, he denied it with an oath. I do not know the man. So that's an extra phrase there. This time he took an oath. It doesn't say what the oath was, but he could have swore by something and said, I do not know the man. And then the third denial is in verse 74. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. So the most emphatic denial is that third one. And then the rooster crowed. Consider this. In Matthew 10:28, Jesus told his disciples, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And later in verses 32 and 33, Jesus said, so everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. And sadly, that last part applies to Peter. He denied Jesus before men, before a young girl. He denied Jesus. He failed his Lord. My fifth and final point is that Jesus alone is faithful. Consider Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Like Peter and the other disciples, Jesus was not happy to be faced with the prospect of his death. He likely felt the same kind of fear that they did, in fact, probably more intensely. Okay, look at 26 verse 38. Then Jesus said to his disciples, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Now, Jesus is true God, but remember, he's also true man. And the fact that he is true God did not take away from the emotions or the experience that any other man would have had in his situation, contemplating the kind of death that Jesus would soon face. And so he was sorrowful, even to the point of death. And listen to what he prayed in verse 39. He fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Again in verse 42, The second time, Jesus went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." In verse 44, he prayed the same words again. Okay? Where the other disciples, they crumbled under the pressure, the fear, Jesus turned to prayer. He had the same fear, he had the same trepidation, but he turned to his Father. And by praying to his Father, he gained the strength to get up and to accomplish the mission that he was sent to do. And one of my favorite parts of this story is that Jesus actually sees Judas and the mob coming to arrest him before they can see him. Look at verse 46. After praying, Jesus says to his sleeping disciples, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So Jesus was on his knees in prayer, but he stood up to meet them. And when Judas betrayed him with a kiss, he told him, "Do what you came to do." I love his bravery, his courage, and I love his faithfulness. And when Jesus was on trial before the Sanhedrin, he refused to defend himself against all those false accusations. Isaiah 53 prophesied that like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Jesus remained silent until the high priest put him under oath, and then Jesus made the good confession of who he was, knowing full well that they would accuse him of blasphemy and condemn him to death for saying so. Jesus alone was faithful. He was faithful to his Father, and he was faithful to you and to me. He was faithful to give up his life as a ransom for many. He was faithful to pour out his blood for the forgiveness of our sins. I'll close this message with this important saying from St. Paul in 2 Timothy 2:11 through 13. Paul writes, "This saying is trustworthy, for if we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." Amen.